thank you so much for joining us on this Monday evening, and happy early Thanksgiving to those who celebrate. For some, it's just a nice day off. So thank you guys for joining us here on Monday. We're so excited to have you. My name's McKaylee. I work with Tattered Bookstore. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time in our virtual community, welcome. I'm so excited to have you and be expanding our community space here that we have online, carved out our little corner of the internet. And for those of you who have joined us, this is Old Hat. You're sick of my face by now. Thank you for joining us again. I really do appreciate it, as do all of my coworkers. Thank you also for continuing to support Tattered Bookstore, local independent bookstores, and local businesses. We really appreciate it. For those of you who may not know about Tattered Cover, we are a local independent bookstore in Denver, Colorado. We have 4 locations in the Denver metro area. Right now, 3 out of the 4 of our locations are open. Our flagship location, Colfax Avenue, is closed right now until further notice, but we are opening up curbside pickup so that those of you who may have books that are waiting to be picked up at that location, you could start doing that tomorrow. Just check our website and social media for time updates. But we're happy to serve you guys in that way. Our Aspen Grove, which is our southern store, Lodo, right in the middle of downtown, as well as Union Station, are all open, and you can come and join us and visit as long as you wear your mask over your mouth and your nose. You can come and join us for about 90 minutes or so, or come pick up your books as you'd like. But we would also like to remind you that tattercover.com is open 24 hours, 7 days a week, and you can shop in your pajamas. I know that I worked most of the day in my pajamas, so I understand the desire to do that. And you know, everybody knows November is the new December, so we got a couple of great savings for our Friends of Tattered Cover members, which lasts for another couple of days, and we just are so grateful to still be here in the midst of this global pandemic that we have going on right now, and that is thanks to you. And it's also thanks to you that we're able to have authors like the one that we have tonight. Really quickly, I want to let you know as well that closed captioning is enabled on this video for those who might want it or need it. All you have to do is on the screen that you're watching me on right now, just hover your mouse over the screen, and there's a black bar at the bottom. There's a button on the black bar that says CC on it. And if you just click that button there, you'll be able to enable closed captioning. Instructions for that are also down below. Now, it is my honor to introduce the author that we have this evening. We have Katherine E. Standefer. She is the author of Lightning Flowers, My Journey to Uncover the Cost of Saving a Life, which was shortlisted for the 2018 J. Anthony Lucas Works in Progress Award for the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. Lightning Flowers was named one of the Oprah Magazine's best books of fall 2020, was featured in People magazine and on NPR's Fresh Air, and it received a Kirkus starred review. Trust me, you're gonna wanna read this book, guys. Lightning Flowers is the November 2020 New York Times Book Review Group Text Pick and was an Editor's Choice staff pick in the November 29th, 2020 edition of the New York Times Book Review. And it is my honor to welcome Katherine here tonight. We're going to have her turn on her camera here now so that she can join me virtually. Oh, almost. There she is. Hello, Katherine.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's for some a holiday weekend, and I'm just really grateful that we could come and celebrate your wonderfully unique but important book that you've given us and gifted the world with. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I feel like wonderfully unique needs to go on the next cover.
Right? Yes, you can use my blurb. You can have that. So you were talking to me before we started that you had like perfected your elevator pitch for this book because it is so, you know, two things that mining and medical world that you just never thought would come together, and yet you blend it so beautifully. If you wouldn't mind sharing us that elevator pitch to get people started who might not know about this wonderful new book.
Absolutely. Lightning Flowers tells the story of my troubled relationship to my own implanted cardiac defibrillator, which is a device intended to save me from a inherited arrhythmia that my younger sister and I both have. But the device has not necessarily been life-saving in my experience and actually may have caused harm. And so the book really thinks about what it means to save a life and what the value of one life is. In particular, my life. The book is a story of my fight to access an implanted cardiac defibrillator as an uninsured 24-year-old in the year 2009 when the healthcare debates were raging. And then that story continues on within the context of the American healthcare system as I access Obamacare to get later care, which is both a gift and a little bit of a burden at times. And the book also goes on a global journey to understand the device's supply chain. So I really was asking, what if saving a life in the West requires loss of life elsewhere? And I mean human life, I mean non-human life. So the book travels to mines in Madagascar, South Africa, and Rwanda. And of course, in my personal research, I traveled many other places thinking about the complex issues of the book and what it takes to make the metal that went into my body.
Absolutely. And you talk about so many places in this book, and I know we're going to touch on that in our conversation, but I'd love it. I'm gonna be cheesy here, but I love it if you could take us on a bit of a journey with a small reading real quick and just kind of give us a taste about what this book is. And if I'm not mistaken, this part that you're going to read us takes us to another sometimes familiar place to some of us who might live here in Colorado. So if you don't mind just sharing that bit with us, and then we can launch into our conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is a really special night for me because when I was 24 and passed out in that parking lot in Jackson, Wyoming, as an uninsured, person who was trying to build a writing career and using jobs in outdoor education to kind of pay the bills on the side. The place I ended up moving to in order to get an implanted cardiac defibrillator was Boulder. My younger sister was at the time a student at the University of Colorado. She had started going into cardiac arrest when she was a freshman, just a few weeks into school. We didn't know what was happening. It was like, oh, she's passing out. Was she drunk? Is it a seizure? Didn't make any sense. And then luckily in December of 2007, she happened to pass out in front of a medical professional who recognized this particular arrhythmia. And my parents got a phone call from Boulder Community Hospital telling them that they wouldn't release their daughter until she had an ICD implanted. ICD, of course, is the implanted cardiac defibrillator. So my younger sister's surgeon, when I was in trouble trying to understand whether or not I needed an ICD and trying to figure out how to do that as an uninsured person, he was my second opinion. And he said, you need to make your arrangements. He was very concerned about the potential for me to experience sudden cardiac arrest again. And he said, if you come to Colorado, I can donate my fee. And the social services are better than in Wyoming. And as I explored my options, that ended up really being the only reasonable option that we had. So in this passage, I have just quit all of my jobs and gotten in the car and driven to Boulder. I've spent the first, about week sleeping on my sister's sorority house floor on the hill. Thank you, Alpha Chi Omega. And then my mom had flown in hoping to help me move into an apartment to establish residency, and we weren't able to get that logistics settled while she was there. So in this excerpt, she has just left and I have just settled into the University Inn on the hill in Boulder. At the end of the weekend, I dropped my exhausted mother at the airport and checked into the University Inn, a sallow green motel with a thin white metal rail running along each floor. The hospital sat at the bottom of the hill, where campus transitioned into downtown, just a few blocks from the library. The first time I turned into the parking lot, a woman stood screaming in a window on the first floor, her curtains drawn wide open, hands dangling at her hips. She had the tough skin of a smoker, hollowed cheeks. I watched her mouth move violently, soundlessly, from inside my car. Her shoulders shook, tired-looking bleached hair piled on her head. Was she talking to someone I couldn't see? I put the car in park and craned my head around, trying to see. No one. The parking lot was mostly empty, and when I got out, I could hear her muffled voice against the glass. I tried not to look again, not to stare, stepping quickly toward reception, but her muffled, crackling voice followed me, would not shake loose. The next morning, as I went to retrieve free breakfast from the buffet against the office wall, a big man stood solidly next to her door, talking quietly. He had a buzz cut and fat black sideburns. At his feet, the remnants of the night, a plate of little square hamburgers, cigarette butts, aluminum foil folded into a plastic Lunchables tray. The woman hunched as she brought more trash out. She was quiet, but more broken looking. Her face would come to me over and over, the violent shape of a screaming mouth muffled by glass, wondering what she was on, what she was doing in that motel. In the morning, I checked out of the motel and buried myself back in the over-air-conditioned library. Public and tribal land stewardship intern, spa attendant, barista, undergraduate admissions counselor, dispatcher for Safe Walk program, substitute preschool teacher, server. The resumes went out. I prayed someone would read them. It was hard to believe that I had only been in town 1 week. These Boulder days seemed tumorous. I ducked out of the library to take calls from Sam, who had started calling me 3 times a day. Otherwise, we felt disconnected and squabbled. "Are you sure you don't want me to come?" he had asked the morning I loaded my car. I'd shaken my head. "No use having 2 of us in limbo," I said. "I don't know what's going to happen. You need to work. You can come once there's an apartment." I still thought it was true, but now I felt the gap opening between us. 500 miles northwest, he still woke in our bed beneath Snow King Mountain, the valley cool and socked in with rain. He drank coffee out of our mugs in our dark wooden boat of a living room. He diced vegetables from our farm share. In some way, my life went on without me there, and I imagined myself like a ghost setting water over the burner to boil, or heading off into the pine woods with a group of hikers. Maybe I should just get in the car and drive the 8 hours home, I thought, picturing our gravel drive, my hands in Sam's sun-bleached hair. But what would it solve? I was still far from being a Colorado resident, still nowhere near surgery. The first business day passed without a call from the property manager. I returned to the University Inn, to a different tired room. Here the days began to string together. My parents worried that if they guaranteed the lease for me, it would somehow come to light when the hospital evaluated my need for financial aid and would disqualify me. My best friend from college, McKendra, the only 25-year-old I knew who was a homeowner, offered to co-sign. But she worked for a wild horse advocacy organization, and that summer there were roundups on the Forest Service land in the Pryor Mountains of north central Wyoming. So she sent her faxes at night to the property management company from a motel in Lovell on the edge of the wilderness. Faxes that arrived only in parts, first all signature and no agreement, then all agreement and no signature. Then one of the faxes finally went through. Her work was done, but a top manager was required to sign all leases. He wasn't in, and wasn't in. And then he was, but there was no key. Each morning I put my things into my car. Each day I called the property manager from the library. And each night I returned after the close of business hours to the University Inn, poured wine into plastic cups. The apartment shifted into a mirage. The surgery receded into impossibility. The next afternoon, I went to my 1-month checkup with Dr. Oza. Despite all the problems I'd had with beta blockers, in light of my sister's life-saving shock, he raised my dosage again. After the appointment, flattened, I called Sam, crying. I did not want that hard fist of metal inside me, or a lifetime hitch to the American medical system, which I was now excluded from as a matter of policy. But having it implanted was my only hope for going off those stranglingly high doses of beta blockers. That's the medication that controls the arrhythmia. Having it implanted seemed my only chance of feeling safe again. Once inside me, the ICD would be watching my heart all the time, a computer that counted beats per minute and recorded high heart rates, theoretically distinguishing between dangerous and normal rhythms. But even if I didn't receive shocks, every 3 months I would need to have the system checked, my computer's recordings downloaded. I would never again be just a flesh being. In the back of the cardiology office, they would hook me to a computer to check my settings. They would use its buttons to race and palpitate my heart, making sure the device could still control it, looking for the sudden changes in resistance or responsiveness that meant something had happened to my device or wires. I would never again walk through an airport metal detector. I would never have an MRI. I didn't want it. But I did not understand how I was supposed to live with death staring me down like that if I went without it. How I would live with these climbing doses of a drug that left me limp and out of breath. How I was supposed to do normal things and not always expect to die. It was too much. I needed a reminder, I told Sam, of why my life was worth saving. My room that night backed up to the strip of park along the Boulder Creek. And the sound of the men in the park along the creek came in through the window more loudly than before. I could hear the men shaking out old comforters, men who were once children, I knew, men who were once boys, who sat in classrooms, who played, what the world had done to them, how the world had failed them. The laughter that came through my window did not feel safe, did not feel like laughter. I leaned against the headboard holding a mug of wine. I had been crying for hours. I had been on the phone with my mother telling her I did not want to live. "What are you going to do?" she asked me, fear in her voice, and I couldn't answer. But I stared at the bottle of heart medication on the orange bedspread beside me, and I knew I could take them all. Beta blockers, a drug that had as its side effect low blood pressure, vasodilation. I could go limp in this world. I could block out the men whose lives had shrunk to the banks of the river, the crazy woman with her frizzled hair and wild late night grief. I could block out the life I had loved, gone now. I saw it clearly. What could fix the threat of my own death was death. 500 miles northwest of me, Sam was arriving at board game night. Then my phone rang. It was a student from the private liberal arts college I'd gone to, just calling to update my address. I began to cry, then to laugh. "I don't know," I told her. "I have no fucking clue what my address is." "Are you in a position to contribute to the annual fund?" she asked sweetly, politely. "No," I said. "No, I'm waiting to have heart surgery and I can't find a job." I wept into my hands, the phone cradled against my shoulder, full of the distance between the self I had been in that hotel room and the self I had been in college. "That college is the nicest place you'll ever be," I told her. "Good luck to you." I hung up and lay on the bed, extinguished, the bottle of pills on the bed beside me. And then a voice inside me said, "Put on your shoes." The voice said, "Go to the bookstore right now." I walked down Broadway, stepped onto the Pearl Street Mall with its humming bars and teens eating ice cream and men playing guitar for tips, and into the glittering storefront of the Boulder bookstore. I bought a copy of The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay and another of The Alchemist. I read them. In this way, I lived until morning.
I love that section that you picked to read. It's as a bookseller, as a book lover, like the way that those healed you in that moment, like brought you escape, brought you comfort, like, and shout out to Boulder Bookstore. I know we're tattered cover here, but you know, there's something to be said for independent bookstores around the country that can provide that. And so when you had said, I was hoping when we were talking about what section she was going to read before this. And I was like, I hope she gets to the Boulder section, the Boulder bookstore. But I'm so glad you read that. And I think it's something that resonates with a lot of people. And I think your story, even though it is so unique in some ways, is also ironically very universal, because you're so vulnerable in it. And I'm curious, I would love to start off our conversation with kind of a rough question of how it took you about 8 years to complete this. What did that process look like, having to go over this hard time in your life, add on this extra research? You know, where did it start for you? I think that's really the best question, is where did this start for you in this process?
That's a great question and kind of a complex question.
Yeah, I'm sure. Sorry.
That's okay. There are definitely a few different stages of the writing of this book and my thinking of it as a book.
Yeah.
Mind if I turn on this light that's next to me?
Please do. You're good. See, we're all getting used to virtual worlds and all the lighting and technology. We all become videographers. Plus, we get a very great look at her house. Beautiful. You would not believe, I've met so many authors' pets, author houses, like bookshelf tours. Like, it's the coolest insider's look ever. So don't get me wrong, you have a gorgeous interior. Look at those bookshelves.
One day in front of that bookshelf, but it didn't work out quite right.
I love that this is like the one wall in my entire house that doesn't have bookshelves on it. Like, I literally could touch 3 bookshelves right here.
You need to rearrange.
But speaking of books, tell us about your book and when you started thinking about it as a book, your story.
So I understood as the events in 2009 were unfolding that I would write about this someday. And so there's sort of the double consciousness of being a writer and understanding like, whoa, this is a wild thing to be living. And honestly, I'm so grateful for my younger self, who was a journaler and a letter writer and an obsessive note taker, because it means I have access. These scenes were built for me. I mean, who would have remembered the woman screaming at the university inn? And yet there's a way she forms this backdrop of my own sort of like flirt with losing sanity because of the constant proximity to death and my understanding of the way privilege was holding me aloft at this moment of my life. And if it hadn't been, I could have seen, the things that happen to people when they're trying to manage unmanageable things without resources. So I'm just so grateful that I knew that then. That said, I was primarily a fiction writer and a poet at that time. And so the first stage of this book was that I kept trying to write these thinly veiled fictional pieces in about 2010, 2011, very shortly after some of the early events in the book. And I really had this reckoning of like, I think you have to write this as you. Yeah. And I didn't really know, other than environmental writing, like how people wrote nonfiction. I didn't read a lot of memoirs at the time, but I ended up applying to MFA programs in nonfiction. And I understood that I was going, I said, to write about sex and death. And so in one of my first workshops, that's what I do. Great. So in one of my early workshops, I turned in this essay about myself and my sister and our defibrillators. And people were like, there's so much here. And it was the kind of very unfulfilling workshop that happens when you have a book, when you just need to write a much larger thing. But I didn't understand yet what the framing would be. And a couple months later, the framing really arrived. This book opens with a prologue that includes me taking 2,000 volts to the heart in the form of 3 shocks that at the time I didn't know if they might be saving my life, but they actually turned out to be accidental. And so in the weird moments after taking those 3 shocks to the heart, I had this question sort of land in my body in this bizarre way that ended up obsessing me. And the question was, as I gestured toward earlier, like if the metal in my body that just saved my life came from these places where, a conflict mineral scenario was unfolding and there were women being kept as sex slaves or children kind of conscripted through debt bondage to work, if forests were dismantled, like, was it worth it? What does it mean to save my life? And what is the level of destruction elsewhere that is appropriate to save a life like mine, if you can even answer that question? And I just, in trying to live past the experience of those shocks, which was so profoundly traumatic because it's essentially like being struck by lightning from inside your body. I mean, it's lower voltage than that. I don't want to be in exaggeration there, but the experience of wondering at any given moment whether you might suddenly start taking 850 volts to the heart. It was horrifying. It was a horrifying experience. And I was very much treated by the medical community like it was a normal experience to have. And so my own way of living past it was the research of this book. And so there was sort of a period of time in which I was trying to understand conflict minerals and trying to understand whether you could trace the exact metal in one given defibrillator. Like, can I trace the one in my body? Yeah. And then about the time I figured out that that couldn't happen, I got really interested in widening the question. Like, what are the worst case scenarios and what are the best case scenarios? And I followed that for quite some time until, the second half of the book kicks off with me on a plane to Bogota with a friend of mine for spring break. And my device begins vibrating inside me, which is the warning shot of it letting me know it's about to run out of battery. So I had 3 months at that point to schedule my next surgery. And I'd spent all these years wondering if I should get another device. And then I end up deciding that I should. And what unfolds in the second half of the book is basically a further breakdown of the technology and real questions around, like, what if a life-saving technology not only doesn't save your life, but causes harm to your body that might shorten your life or put your life at risk? And so once that happened, I was like, well, I'm writing this book, but now I'm in acute medical trauma. And should I be taking notes at all of my doctor's appointments? Like, what does it mean to live and be a writer when you know you're writing about the thing you're living so acutely? You know, by then I was more of a professional writer, not just a kid with a journal. So, yeah, the final years of this project, you know, the book ends in June of 2017.
Mhm.
And from that point onward, basically, I was writing the book proposal and then I was under contract. And I was pretty much doing trauma writing for years, renting houses where I was alone, away from community, away from friends, and really working with a lot of healers and a really great trauma therapist to move this book through my body. And part of the reason it is the book it is that there's no part of this that wasn't physically processed by me. And by that, I mean, to talk about, like, there's a scene where a surgery fails late in the book. And I wake up from that procedure in an incredible amount of pain and with this kind of a very out of control situation unfolding. And for that, I had to watch YouTube videos of my procedure in order to be able to describe it. And I would only get a few seconds in before there was overwhelming trauma experience in my body. And to be able to stay with that experience and pause the video and be with exactly what that was. And sometimes moving that experience through meant screaming. Sometimes it meant moving my body in certain ways. Often afterwards, I had to like get myself to a hot spring. I didn't have a bathtub, unfortunately, or get in bed and sleep a lot, because this was not just writing work, it was trauma work. And it was, I will be honest, it was not a fun book to write. And the task of trying to be analytical enough to crunch the research I had done on mining and to get it to connect with these very personal stories was really a striking task, given how embodied the process was. So that's, yeah, that's really the overall arc of that writing.
Well, and it's beautiful that you describe it in that way. And thank you for your vulnerability. You did not have to go into that much detail. And I know you wrote a book about it, but being able to talk about your process in that such an honest manner, thank you for that. And you know, I'm curious because you talk about your personal process and your personal research. And as somebody who has had my own medical issues, my significant other and families, you kind of become a researcher in your own right of your own medical issues, and you become really involved with it. But how much external research did you have to do? What did that process look like? Particularly with the mining, it took you around the world, and where did you start with the medical research, and then again with the mining research?
Yeah, such a great question. So the medical research always unfolded as
you were living it, or?
Certainly there is a component of it that is as I was living it. You know, to have a medical condition like long QT syndrome, which is what our arrhythmia is called, is to constantly have to explain it to other people in a way they will understand and in a way that doesn't make their eyes roll back in their heads. So there's a lot of just like basic, like, what is this thing? How do I talk about it? Which as a writer, it really mattered to me to communicate well about that. We're also making really advanced medical decisions. And so there's a certain amount of just like, what am I even looking at? And I know not everyone does that, and doctors don't always love it when you're, you know, using the internet. By and large, I was like reading white papers for my own medical. I mean, not as much in 2009, but certainly later on, as I came to understand that there was this very fragile interplay between the senses my body was giving me about the right path and the research. Like, reading research for me is a way to check what my intuition is saying. And that's not always a process that there's room for in a doctor's office. Often they sort of have their conclusion already foregone. And then, you know, late in the book, after the wire that connects my device to my heart broke, just as like a tiny spoiler, but there's way more story there.
Yeah, there's a lot more to that, but that is a moment.
Yeah. So like the decision-making process around that, yeah, just really required that I understand what we were even looking at, especially because by that point I was just so leery of being sold any kind of like mythos. The mythos around what it looks like to save a life and the way that we elevate technology is so strong. And so to be able to think like, well, yes, you could die of an arrhythmia. Also, you could die of complications related to the device. And to understand that even though it's sold as the device is a Band-Aid on death, that actually can't be a thing because we all die anyway. And so that's not to say that we should never use defibrillators or that they can't save lives, but it does mean that there's a math unfolding, and that the way my equation looked was, I think, different from a lot of other people's, and different from the way the technological mythos was operating in the culture. So research was really the only thing that could help me there, like to really understand what makes a lead wire break. What is a lead wire? What are the engineering challenges of running a wire from a device into the heart that is wet, that is beating all the time, moving all the time. And therefore, like, you know, by really trying to understand, how do I make decisions that feel good to me? The mining research, God, I feel like I was really lucky, even though I took those shocks to the heart in 2012. I had a period from 2011 until early 2016, where I was basically able-bodied. And it doesn't mean I wasn't moving through some of the processing or the trauma after effects of what I had been through.
Yeah.
But I had a lot more bandwidth to do this sort of exploratory research. And I was in my MFA program from 2012 to late 2014. And so, you know, at one point I got a grant. It also was just expected that you were doing certain, like, moving projects forward. So there was that container. I did a independent study with Allison Deming on writing public health. So I did a ton of research at that time, literally just thinking like, what is going on in the conflict minerals world? Like, what are conflict minerals? Do the policies actually make a difference? And then what are the minerals in my device? For each of those minerals, what are not just the worst case scenarios, but best case scenarios? Because I got really interested in this inversion of research questions where we say, can something like mining actually be life affirming, as we sometimes talk about it in the culture, you know, like bringing development to places, which my book, you know, is not so into by the end.
A little bit on the against side of that, but yeah.
Yeah. So just this question of like, well, here's a mining project in Madagascar that has a lauded corporate social responsibility policy. What does it actually look like in person? And that ended up being more interesting than some of the other like horror story mining narratives that had already been pretty well documented, and that it was pretty easy to fold in as like a line here or there. So the big question for me, I did just like so much reading about mining on the African continent in particular, and then specific minerals all over the world, just to try to get a sense for like, where do I need to put my body to understand this question? Where is my body actually drawn as the entity that contains the metal? And what does it mean to bring a body that is complicit into literal proximity with a place that it may or may not be affecting? And I say may or may not, you know, it is impossible to trace these devices. Also, by the time I finished visiting that mine, I was on to my next device. And so this is like a constant industrial churning. And so it became useful just to say, like, how do we hold the question overall through specific stories, even if we can't like prove that they are the stories? And I just really trusted my body to take me to the right places. And then there was sort of on the other side of that, right? There's the exploding outward, there's the narrowing down. And then there's like really the narrowing down further of like, I did all of this research in this place on these dynamics. Do I know enough to say what my senses I need to say and know that it's sort of fact checkable and verifiable? It's not just coming from my experience actually, even though it's grounded in my experience. And then also like, what are the tiny little pieces that are missing that I need to fill in? There's some of the late research on like cardiology on the African continent as opposed to the US, that it felt like, you know, I really should talk about this here or that there. And so, yeah, really wild, long process.
No, but I find it so interesting, the fact that, and the way that you speak about your body, especially as somebody who has had obviously a very complicated relationship with your body, and how you still have so much trust in it, is very fascinating to me. And that relationship is so interesting in the book. And I want to ask about another relationship and the other characters that you have in the book, like your sister. You know what I mean? What was it like? And I promise everybody viewing, I want to get to your questions as well, because we have a couple here. This will be my final one before we move to them. But I want to ask about what that relationship was like with your sister while writing, you know, and having to characterize the other people, doctors, and the people that you met on your various journeys. Your sister's is the one I'm most particularly interested in. Because again, I know my medical history and my relationship with my sister, who didn't have the same complicated medical history, and how that affected us. What was it like writing about that? Did you have to get her permission? Like, how did that go?
Well, first of all, we can say hi, Christine, because she's from Denver and she's watching.
Hi, Christine. Thanks for letting us talk about you.
100%. I mean, that's really the foundation. It's like, thanks for letting us talk about you. Because I am a firm believer that each of us has the right to tell our story.
Yeah.
And also to fully tell my story really like drags my sister along for the ride. And there's a very real world in which she could have been like, I don't want to be on this ride. Like, let me off.
Yeah.
And, you know, there could have been a stripped down version. There could have been a version that didn't use her actual name. And she, I think, you know, we lived in Boulder together for about 3 years. And at the beginning of it, we were sisters who, when we saw each other, we often like stayed up late talking, and I think we enjoyed each other, but we didn't have like a solid relationship to stand on. And early in the book, I talk about this sense of like her almost dying and me realizing I maybe was about to miss something really important. And when we did live in Boulder together and had a chance to really like go through the process of both being young people with this thing and both being young people with this thing who didn't necessarily have other young people who got this, who were also in relationship to death or having surgeries or whatever. And the resistance that she had, which I talk about a little bit in the book, where my experiences forced her to confront things that I don't think she really wanted to confront. She was much better at just like continuing to live her life. And part of that is because she was insured on a really good plan through my dad when she first went into cardiac arrest. And part of it is because she always had insurance at the moment she needed it. And she did have a wire move in her heart and had to have a device reimplanted at one point. And she has taken accidental shock. So I don't mean to say that her journey wasn't as complicated, but mine just was like wildly complicated. And so she could kind of go on autopilot a little bit more. And one of the things I was really grateful for was that she was willing to hazard these questions. And, you know, I was trying to build scenes. So it's like, okay, when you're at the party, the Christmas party, where your friends don't really acknowledge that you're in a sling, that you just had heart surgery, you're 19 years old. Like, what does the room look like? What do you feel like? Do you remember what you were wearing? Do you have any pictures? I mean,
like Katie.
You just really
heart surgery.
What was that like for you? And that's a hard question to be asked if you have in part survived by not answering it, right? By just like being chill. My dad liked to refer to her as stoic. And that's true about her. And there are great things about that, and there are not great things about that. And I think my process became this sort of invitation into bravery that I think I would have understood if she couldn't step forward, but she did. And she really, our journeys are just not separate now. You know, if I was able to get back to the Mayo and went to have a procedure, she would be there. And that's not something we could offer each other quite the same way when we were really young people. And it's one of maybe the most beautiful outgrowths of this book.
I'm glad to hear that, because again, I have a sister, I have two nieces that are medically complex, and I think about their relationship, and it was something that just on my personal level stuck out to me about the book. But we want to hear from our viewers and what stuck out to you about this book if you've had a chance to read it or something you've heard. If you want to ask Katie about the process of writing or more of her research, please feel free to do so. Some of you are already very active in the chat already. That's to the right of your screen there. I think this is kind of an interesting one to start off with, which is sometimes hard to ask authors when they've just had a book come out. But what is next for you as a writer? What are you working on now? You know what I mean? You got another deeply personal, emotional story you're gonna pull out of your back pocket, or well, what are you thinking?
What else? Everyone who's read the book will feel like they know me and that there's only emotionally deep, raw stories to be told.
For real though.
My joking answer has been like, first a nap.
Yes, that's what I mean. That's why asking people about that, I ask authors that question. People want to know, like, what's next? I'm like, they just gave you a book.
Right. It's like asking someone on their way out of the hospital with their newborn, like, are you having another?
Yeah, exactly.
But I can say that so before I sold Lightning Flowers, I was actually better known for writing about sexuality. I had an essay come out in Best American Essays 2016. And when I lived in Boulder after my surgery in 2009, I got a job in 2010 at Boulder Valley Women's Health Center, a sexual health clinic. And I was the teen clinic manager, and I taught sex ed all over Boulder County. And there are a lot of really unresolved strains there for me. I was writing 2 books simultaneously until I sold Lightning Flowers. And so I do have the sense that that project, which I think is a lot about embodiment through a different lens. It's about being a pretty religious and abstinence-focused teenager, and then having my first sexual experience be sex assault at age 22, my first kiss, and feeling that breaking open of like, the self you thought you were is gone, and so what happens now? And the question of like, how much we trust our bodies and when we trust our bodies and how we learn to trust our bodies, and the process of teaching sex ed at the same time, really, that I was coming into my own sexuality. And, you know, the place that I am now with that story is much more interested in relationality and eros, not just with other humans, but with other species, and the type of way we are wired for intimacy and assume that only means intimacy of particular types. And the way, as someone who's now been single for 10 and a half years, I don't feel the loneliness that I used to carry because of the way I exist on the land. And that was very true before I ever became sexually active. I was very devoted to abstinence. And so this sort of, there's something there for me about embodiment and sexuality and, you know, healing shame and being in relationship with land. And I don't totally know how it all plays together, but I know that that's probably the next piece.
Yeah, I'm down. I'm here for it. Sounds interesting to me. So this is a really interesting question here too. The book talks a lot about privilege and has like an interesting examination of privilege. Can you talk a little bit more about why you wanted to highlight that and how it became such an important part of the book?
Yeah, that is such an important question, and I'm so grateful for it. The best place to start is that when I first passed out in a parking lot at 24 as an uninsured person, I thought I was a victim. And there is certainly a sort of clear-cut way you can say like, oh, look, young, otherwise healthy person now cannot access the healthcare system because of a pre-existing condition. Policy is written in such a way that this person cannot access care. And also, what I couldn't see until I was actually writing an essay called At the University In much later was all of the ways the system was conspiring to help me. And you know, privilege is hard to talk about because it is all of the things we can't see. It's like a very intentional turning toward, okay, what's working here? What am I not acknowledging as working in my favor? And learning to see that. And one of the things that was working in my favor was certainly socioeconomics. I was the daughter of a corporate lawyer, which means not only that my dad was able to help me move to Boulder and pay rent on a brand new apartment, put down a deposit do some of that stuff while I looked for a job to establish residency. But it also meant that we were educated people used to working within systems. We understood how to look up, like, what are the programs? Where might the programs be? How can I call people and talk to them? And then this like much more personal question of like, who is willing to help me? And I have wondered significantly whether showing up in Dr. Oza's, patient room at this clinic in Boulder might have been a really different story if I were not a white educated woman. And that's not a question specific to Dr. Oza. Dr. Oza is a total gold heart and I adore him. But there's a question there about the way the system responds to educated white people as opposed to other types of people. And I could not see that at the time, right? I was so worried about dying every day, and I was so uncomfortable being financially dependent on my father in this way that felt like he could pull his support at any minute, and I am just sunk. Like, my life is in ruins. And so, like, I need to be supportive of myself in the sense that, like, the terror and shakiness that I felt that night in the hotel room that I almost ended my life, that's real. And it existed in coordination with all these other pieces of privilege that are really important. So ultimately, I should say, not only did Dr. Oza donate his fee for the surgery, but the anesthesiologist donated his fee, and St. Jude Medical provided my defibrillator, and Boulder Community Hospital provided $84,000 toward my medical costs. And I just don't know what that would have looked like for someone else. So that's sort of piece one. The second piece is that I really worked to talk about privilege in these sections about mining in Africa, because I did not understand when I first went to the continent for these research trips, because I had not begun anti-racism work in earnest, really not until 2016. I didn't understand that my white body showing up in certain places could be a form of violence on its own. And that was really hard to feel in certain places and like not really know what it was. And a lot of the writing of those sections has been this long work of like, what were the subterranean dynamics there? Some of it I definitely knew. The French colonial imprint upon Madagascar is pretty rough. And so my white body was definitely viewed through those lenses, but not just white body, also American body, again, educated. I really had to come to understand that, like, even though the journey was based in complicity always, this question of like, is my life causing suffering for others? Is saving my life causing this impact on other people or places? There still was that sense of like, oh, am I gonna help by telling the stories of these people? And ultimately, like, that's problematic, right? Like, white people cannot waltz into contexts halfway across the world and necessarily even understand the information they're being given, even if they do have a great translator, which I unfortunately did not in several parts of this book. So there was just a real like humility and an uncomfortable awareness by the end of my trip to Madagascar in particular, that I really wanted to believe the people who were more like me, because they just seemed like they were better sources, right? And in chapter 11, when I'm at a Rio Tinto, it's a mine called QMM that Rio Tinto owns 80% of in southern Madagascar. And there's a man who, man, what he told me sounded really good. And later studies came out that showed that that's not really what was happening there. And I just was really thinking about the complicity of being the kind of person who has a certain degree, who drinks cocktails on the porch of a certain type of hotel, who talks about the world in terms of capitalism or these like colonial ways of seeing things. And yeah, to try to get the book to reflect that was really a key part of the work of writing this book, really just in the last year, because I had not done enough anti-racism work to be articulate in the ways I needed to earlier on.
Yeah, and I think the socioeconomic and the idea too of, you know, the privilege of being able-bodied is something that's also very interesting to me, and that came up in it, you know, because having a disability, anybody can become disabled at any time, you know, and it's something that you experienced of when this revelation was brought in your life. And you know, I feel like we could keep talking about this subject for hours, but I want to get to this last question that we have here. And that is, and I think this is going to be great coming from you, but what advice do you have for someone wanting to write memoir nonfiction? And I'm particularly interested when you talk about it being such a body experience, because people often talk about their minds when they talk about writing, but you've mentioned this experience in your body, not just with the trauma, but with the writing. And you say things like where your body leads you. And I'm curious if you could maybe put that spin on it when you give this piece of advice.
Yeah, I love that question.
Is it? I twisted it a little bit. It was like, what advice do you have? But to me, having been in this conversation with you and experiencing this moment with you, it's something I just picked up on a lot. And I think something, again, that we think of as so cerebral, you've brought it to a very earthy level of being in your body.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, good writing always has stakes, and we can often tell where the stakes are based on our bodily response. And I am a big fan of noticing fear or shame actually as the places the story wants to go. And that a lot of the writing, so I also have been teaching writing since I graduated from my MFA, or I guess through my MFA. And so I've read, thousands of student essays and private client essays. And the works that don't feel done to me, whether they end up published or not, have this sort of hollowness where the reckoning hasn't fully unfolded. And that is bodily. It's really uncomfortable. I think we like to talk about writing on these sort of like timelines and show up every day for this amount of time, and this sort of like capitalist expectations of production. And I am very much an embodied artifact. I don't know if that's the right word. I'm an embodied.
It is right now.
Of writing as kind of an underworld experience. And I understand that not all writing is like that, but I think the writing we need most as a society is like that. And I think writing that has the full power of the writing of the writer in it is like that. There's this very terrifying bravery that is required, that might also require different types of spiritual or bodily support from other parts of one's life. So I call myself a trauma writing doula now. I accompany nonfiction writers on the underworld experience of moving these difficult stories through their bodies.
Business card with that on it.
That's a line from my website.
That to head out at writing classes.
Yeah. And so much of it is non-linear, and like, what are the other ways to hack what is getting in the way of the story moving forward, and what types of healing need to happen, whether it's literal, like hands on the body work, or whether it's having a conversation with someone in your life, interviewing them about their experience. Like, yeah, the body protects us by holding stories back when we're not ready for them. And there's a way in which we have to really prepare a safe place for stories to come forward and be safe people with our own stories. My book writing process was also a self-love process, because if I hadn't been able to hold my own story with compassion, if I hated myself for getting sick as a young person, if I thought I was driving away people in my life, whether the partner I talk about in this book or family members who had to financially support me, right? Like all of that shame, I wouldn't have been able to hold this story in the same way. And ultimately, the late scenes in the book were so hard for me because I have become a kind of verbally violent, hysterical person in some medical settings because of the trauma I've suffered, because of the feeling of fighting for my life within systems that can't hear me and needing so badly to be heard. And for me to be on the team of the woman who has gone through all that, for me to understand why she's hysterical, changes the way the story gets told. And so I think that's my answer to that question. Like, these stories are embodied, and let them be embodied, and do the brave work of moving them through your body, and trust that stoppages, especially if there's fear or shame present, are the places, they are the paths you have to walk next.
And I think in a way, this advice was, as you said to your sister, an invitation to bravery for those who might be hesitating to write their story or share it or move the story that they're working on in that direction. So thank you for that. Thank you for this gift of a book. Thank you for this wonderful interview. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I hate to see it end, honestly, but I want to give you an opportunity to remind people who you are, about your book, where they can find you online before we close out for the evening. So take it away, Katie.
Thank you.
Beautiful cover.
Yeah, the book with the beautiful cover with lightning flowers. We didn't talk about lightning flowers. Lightning flowers are the thin branched burns that can.
We didn't even get to lightning flowers. I did want to ask, I had a whole question here about the title and just, dang it.
I'm just going to drop it in. When electricity moves through the body, it follows the path of water, and it can cause people to have these feathery, beautiful burns that are as beautiful as they are terrible. And that's the way I think of this story that I told when I took 3 shocks to the heart. I wondered if I had lightning flowers inside my body. I could smell my own burned tissues from the electric shocks, and just wondered what it meant to be marked in that way by electricity. So this is Lightning Flowers. You can buy it a tattered cover, and you should.
Yes,
my website is katherinestandifer.com. I was on NPR's Fresh Air last week, and so there's an episode there waiting for you. And I have a whole list of book events and a few teaching engagements coming up on my website, one of which I'm doing a little 1-hour like tease of a presentation on December 4th called Trauma Writing as Initiation.
You are starting your trauma writing doula career. I love it. I just, like I said, thank you. I'm sure I'm not the only one who picked out things that I need in my personal life from this conversation, but also from the book. And I really encourage you to get your copy of Lightning Flowers today from Tattered Cover Bookstore, your local independent bookstore. We really appreciate the support right now. For some of you, it's dinner time. Maybe think about ordering from a local mom and pop restaurant that you have out there. Local communities need your support right now, and it's the reason that we're going to survive this and get through this together. So Katherine, if you'll stay on here while I close this out. My name is McKaylee. I'm with Tattered Cover Bookstore. I want to thank you guys again for joining us this evening. Stay safe and happy reading. Bye, all. And we're out.
Awesome.
Yay, that was so, I could have